Hey guys, what's up? Today we're looking at the Canon T7. This is an interesting camera because it has the same sensor as the Canon 80D, Canon M6, and the Canon SL2. But before you get too excited, it has a different imaging processor. So what does that mean? Let's do an in-depth review to see exactly what this camera is capable of, who exactly it's for, and what it can do for you. Let's check it out. So right out of the box, this is a beautiful sensor. Same sensor as the 80D, SL2, and M6. You get beautiful images, it's got the Canon look, and it's a 24 megapixel sensor that gives you 14-bit RAW. For photos alone, this camera is amazing. It doesn't do very high shutter speeds. It only does 3 frames per second, but if you're not doing sports photography, this is a great camera. So this has a slightly lower end image processor. What does that mean? Think of it as like the brain of the camera. The sensor is very robust, but the brain of the camera just doesn't operate as fast. So because of that, you can't take photos as fast. This camera only does 3 frames per second. For video, it only goes up to 30 frames per second. But other than that, like just for standard speeds, you get a beautiful image. And that's okay. This camera is part of the Canon T line, which is a beginner, entry level, no frills. You just got interested in photography, you just kind of want to start taking photos, you're very new to this, you're just kind of checking out photography. That's who the T-line's really meant for, and they're trying to give you a nice robust package and a nice robust image without you having to pay a lot. I think this camera is an absolute steal. Right now in Canada, this camera goes anywhere between $500 to $530 on Amazon, and in the States, it goes as low as $480. I highly recommend you pick up this camera if you're just kind of checking out photography, just kind of getting into it as a hobby. You don't really want to break the bank with like a $5,000 or $6,000 DSLR. If you're looking to do photos, this camera will give you exactly what you want. For $500, you get 14-bit RAW and you get the gorgeous Canon look. If you're not familiar with what the Canon look is, it's essentially really nice skin tones, a beautiful warm glow in all the photos, and essentially like it's one of those cameras that just, your photos look good right out of the box with minimal editing. That's really what Canon is known for. It just looks good out of the box. As for the video in this camera, it does not let you down. You get a gorgeous full HD image at 30 frames per second and 23 frames per second. By the way, quick side note, as for 60 frames per second, it is available in this camera, but only at 720p. However, I don't imagine it being an issue for most beginners and most hobbyists. If you're looking to start working in a non-professional capacity, this camera would be a great starting point. So here's my one hang up with this camera. The autofocus for photo is great, but for video, it leaves a lot to be desired. Most likely you're gonna have to do a lot of manual focusing because the autofocus for video is not that great. I've been manually focusing lenses for 10 years, and to be honest, I know it takes a lot of practice. If you're a beginner or just someone that wants to vlog worry-free, I would maybe look into a different camera like the 80D or the T7i, because to be quite honest, it takes quite a bit of practice, and if you're just like a hobbyist, it's gonna be a headache. But let me be clear, the autofocus for photo is spectacular, 10 out of 10. Autofocus for video, not so great. Photos, completely awesome. Let's talk about ISO and low light. This camera goes from 100 to 6400 ISO, but to be honest, I wouldn't really push it past 3200. This camera has a Digic4 processor, which doesn't have very good noise reduction. It's really not meant for low light. And to be honest, this is a beginner camera and shooting in low light is fairly tricky. I'd probably stay away from shooting in low light or get a different camera. Let's talk about the screen on this camera. I recently reviewed the Canon M6, the SL2, and the 80D, and they all have touchscreens, they all have articulating screens, and I've kind of fallen in love with the articulating touchscreens. This camera has none of those things. It's a very standard screen that's just built into the back of the camera. It's not the greatest, but for $500, it's hard to ask for any of that. This camera isn't really meant to be fancy. It's meant for beginners, hobbyists, people who just want to take photos without any of the bells and whistles. Sadly, because this camera doesn't have an articulating screen, it's hard to recommend for vlogging. Maybe if you have a friend that can tell you if you're in focus or not, but to be honest, it'd be kind of risky to vlog with. If you really want to start filming and taking photos, this is a great camera because it's so cheap. But if you can afford a little bit more, I recommend maybe the SL2 or the M6 for vlogging. Next, let's talk about the build quality of this camera. This camera feels very standard. What do I mean by that? It definitely doesn't feel premium like a $3,000 or $4,000 camera or even like an $1,800 camera. But it doesn't feel like it's gonna break either. It's definitely made of all plastic. It has a nice chunky feel to it like a DSLR should. It definitely doesn't feel like it's gonna break on me, and I think if you bought this camera, it'll probably last you a really long time. For $500, I would give this camera a B+ or an A- for quality and build feel. However, I think if you're a beginner or a hobbyist, you'll be perfectly happy with this camera and you'll really enjoy using it. By the way, quick side note, one thing that really surprised me about this camera is that it actually has NFC and Wi-Fi connectivity with your phone. That's pretty impressive for a $500 camera. At the end of the day, this is a $500 Canadian and $480 USD camera. Most people pay that much for a crappy point and shoot. At that price point, this camera is a steal. I would choose this camera over a crappy point and shoot any day. I've been shooting Canon for almost 10 years now, and I would really recommend this camera for someone who's a beginner or a hobbyist. And as for vlogging, I think this camera would be really difficult to vlog if you're pointing it at yourself, but I think this camera would be really good for someone that wants to make daily YouTube videos where they're pointing it at other things. Hey guys, thanks for checking out the video. There's a link in the description below if you want to learn more about the camera, and don't forget to like and subscribe for future content. And don't forget, I'm personally answering every single one of your questions in the comments below, so if you have any questions at all, feel free to hit me up. Until next time.